Thank you for joining us. My name is Mateo. I'm the Federal Climate Campaign Manager for the Maryland League of Conservation Voters. I'm so pleased to be joined today by Dr. Ben Zaitchik. He's a professor in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Johns Hopkins University, where he studies hydroclimatic variability across a range of spatial and temporal scales. This includes work on fundamental atmospheric and hydrological processes, as well as application to problems of water resources, agriculture, and human health. Prior to joining Johns Hopkins University, Dr. Zaitchik was a research associate at NASA and a fellow at the US State Department. He holds a PhD in geology and geophysics from Yale University, an MS in soil sciences from Cornell University, and a BA in biology from Harvard College. He is currently the president-elect of the GeoHealth section of the American Geophysical Union and co-chair of the World Meteorological Organization Task Team on COVID-19. The reason we're having this conversation is that it is an important moment in the history of climate change and in the efforts to meet the moment of the climate crisis. As many of our listeners may be aware, there's currently a critical piece of legislation being negotiated in Washington, D.C. that would be the most significant effort to address the climate crisis to date in the United States. This piece of legislation is called the Build Back Better agenda. Currently, it has passed the House as of last fall, and it's being negotiated in the Senate now. As many of our listeners may be aware, the process can be very messy, and we are still fighting to get this bill passed because we know just how important it is for the future of the United States and of the world. And in Maryland in particular, the state has been on the front lines of climate change, and we see the effects every day. From 2010 to 2020, the state experienced 31 extreme weather events, costing upwards of $10 billion in damages. The Build Back Better framework would set the US on a course to meet its climate targets of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030. And in so doing would address the root causes of the climate crisis that have led to those extreme weather events. With over $550 billion in total climate action investments, this would be the largest investment in climate action in American history, full stop. This would involve every sector of our economy transitioning to a clean energy economy across buildings, transportation, industry, electricity generation, agriculture, and climate smart practices in the conservation of our land and water. And while doing this, it would help create good paying union jobs, grow domestic industries, and advance environmental justice, because so often the brunt of the climate crisis have been felt by those in communities of color and in low-income communities. And it's past time for the responses to the crisis to prioritize their needs. For example, the Build Back Better Act will create a civilian climate corps that would enlist a diverse generation of Marylanders in conserving public lands, bolstering community resilience, and addressing the changing climate, all while putting folks in a position where they can prepare for good paying union jobs. So I think our conversation today is a chance to take a step back and talk to a real expert on the science of climate change who can help us understand where we are in this moment and why it's so critical that we act now. I want to thank you again for joining us, Dr. Zaitchik. And my first question is, how did you become interested in the study of climate change?
Yeah, thanks, Kai, and thanks for having me. So I think like a lot of people who ended up in the field of climate change science, I never really meant to do it, kind of fall into it. So I think I became a climate scientist mostly because I'm a child of the 1980s. So that means that I grew up with East African famines on the television news and UNICEF boxes that you carry around at Halloween. And so I think that growing up at the time, you were really aware and motivated by drought, by hunger, and by all the ways in which climate challenges us and how we respond. And so then as I got into the field, you just find that climate change is an unavoidable part of that kind of work. As climate change changes the patterns of the extremes and the need for resilience and our options for resilience, you end up dealing with it in your work on a daily basis if you're doing the kind of research that I'm doing. And then as you get involved, you find more and more how challenging, how really wicked these problems are, because unlike a passing storm, which is complicated enough for people and for society to deal with, when you're dealing with these long-term human-induced patterns, you end up with scientific challenges, certainly, and then you end up with, as we all know, these really civilizational challenges of what we're going to do about these long-term challenges we're facing.
Thank you. It's always fascinating to hear the origin stories of those who study the climate crisis and those who have dedicated their lives to working on it. So I was really interested to read a little bit about your background, to hear about it from your intro there. And I'm no climate scientist myself, but I was fascinated about all the different research projects you've been involved in. I'm wondering, maybe in layman's terms, or for those who are maybe climate curious, how would you explain your research and the biggest projects you've worked on so far?
Yeah, and so, climate science is so diverse, especially these days as we recognize more and more the number of elements that are relevant to us. And so my research group in particular works on a lot of different problems that I'd say are kind of at the intersection of climate and human systems. And for me, I think some of the most interesting takeaways that we've found have been right at that intersection. So just to give one example among many, one of my students was working on the influence that irrigation has on water resources across the United States, because irrigation is the largest consumptive user of water. And what we found was that in some regions, what you might expect, that the amount of water used in irrigation is very sensitive to how much it rains. But then there are other areas in which it's very sensitive to how hot it is, maybe even as sensitive or more sensitive to temperature as it is to precipitation. And what's interesting there is that those places actually tend not to be the most water stressed today. So obviously there is some water stress, that's why they're irrigating, but it's not the places where you're seeing really bad depletion of water resources. But of course, as climate shifts and as you see temperature increases all across that irrigated zone, I think what we're going to find is a shift in where those water stresses play out and all the influences that's going to have on our human activities and on natural systems as those water resources become more stressed, because in those places they're sensitive to these rising temperatures. So it's just a reminder of that all of these natural resource challenges under climate change really exist as dynamics within these deeply coupled human and natural systems. And go on and on, if you let me, about all of the ways that we're looking at that, because it's what I love to study. But I think that gives you a flavor of where we're looking.
Thank you. It's such a important reminder, and it's so easy to forget, but I love the image that you used of the interlocking or interwoven natural and human systems, and it sounds like such important research, and I would love to let you go on about it, but let's move to the current situation. So as I mentioned a moment ago, the threat of climate change seems to become more and more apparent every year. The extreme weather events that I mentioned earlier are unfortunately becoming more and more common. To put it simply, what needs to be done? What is the response needed when we look at the science?
Yeah, so what we need is a rapid and steady transition, right, to low carbon economies. There's just no question that that the primary driver of the changes we're seeing is anthropogenic release of greenhouse gases, setting the carbon cycle off kilter. And so we need to reduce that as quickly as we can. And perhaps we'll talk more about this later. Or certainly, Kai, I'm sure in your work, you're engaged in the details of these policies a lot. I would say, if I'm speaking as a scientist, not on the policy issues, but in the detail for a moment, the one thing that the science makes very clear is that we need ambitious and durable actions, right? And that's a really hard combination, right? Particularly in a democracy, that has the polarized state of politics that we have, and how partisanship has kind of distorted this discourse. And so really, when I look at what could be done in terms of policy priorities, I think I take most heart in any meaningful policies that can break this partisan deadlock. And that doesn't necessarily have to show up like in a congressional vote, and that's your world about, because that politicians take a lot of calculations in how they're actually go on record with a vote, right? But it has to be policies that we can really explain in a way that makes them broadly popular and unlikely to be targets of rollback if you end up with an irresponsible administration or with a change in the political winds, because we need to move quickly, but it does us no good if 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, 10 years from now, it can all be rolled back.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And for those who are listening, and to bring it into this discussion, the Build Back Better Act, what we've been speaking about tonight, is a 10-year program. So it is an allocation of spending over a 10-year period. So even connected to what you just said, it extends past the life of a given presidential administration. But to your point, it doesn't extend forever. And the need for durable policy will continue to be something that activists and those in government and across society will need to pay attention to. So you brought up the importance of allowing people to understand why the proper policies to meet the climate crisis need to be visible in the lives of everyday Americans. So jumping around a little bit I normally ask this question at the end, but since you went there, what would you, can you help us visualize what would the world look like if we do take bold climate action, if we do make those lasting changes to meet the crisis? What would that look like in folks' everyday lives?
So if we do take the bold actions, and so it's a fascinating question, right? Because it plays in so many directions, right? In terms of what changes does it mean for our behavior day to day, it really depends on the path we take, right? There are multiple paths to achieve the carbon reductions that we need. And so we could foresee a situation where perhaps some of us see less change in our day to day, and it's more associated with changes in the underlying energy sources. That's one way to do it. It's not necessarily the best way to do it. We can also foresee a situation in which we migrate as a society to making different choices about how we live, about how we get around, right? And in some ways to make the deep decarbonization targets a reality. That's, I think, the direction we're going to go in. What I really want, I mean, the way that when you first phrased that question, the way it struck me as someone who works on resilience, right, who really works on impacts of climate change, is that a world in which we make these bold decisions and follow through on them on climate action is a really exciting world, right? Because so many of the things that we would do to build climate resilience are things that we should be doing anyway, that have tremendous co-benefits for health, for happiness, for equality. And that really needs to be built into our policies. So it's not just a matter of saying, oh, what do we need to change, right? Or like, what do we have to do to reduce the carbon, and what does that look like? But also, like, if we have cities that are resilient to storm surge and heat waves, what does that look like, right? Well, that looks like a much greener city. That's a city with less impervious surface, right? It's also a city in which living conditions don't suffer from the kind of environmental injustices and inequalities that we see in our cities today. And so if we envision a future in which we are really building our collective resilience to the climate crisis, I think you can see a lot that you like there, and a lot that we really should be doing, and really an opportunity that we should be seizing, almost independent of climate change, right? Just something that we should be doing, that these policies will bring us towards.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. I really appreciate the way you spoke about resilience and about the co-benefits, the way that pursuing social justice, pursuing justice in housing, in the way we construct our cities and the different systems we rely on, not only meets the needs of the climate crisis, but allows us to address so many other issues in our society, those injustices that you alluded to. And the transformation that you described, one of the reasons why legislation like the Build Back Better Act is so important is that transition, if done properly, could fund a strong middle class by enabling those transitions to be made through putting people to work in good jobs, family sustaining jobs, union jobs, that would benefit the middle class here in the US. So I want to talk about some numbers, if that's okay, for the next question. So the Build Back Better Act, President Biden, so many of these public figures and policies bring up this number of a 52% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions below 2005 levels by 2030. And I'm wondering if we can kind of unpack that a little bit. Why is that goal important? and what investments or actions would enable us to achieve that goal? And if I can cram one more question in here, what's the next goal after that? Where do we need to go following that 52% reduction?
Yeah, there's a lot in there to unpack, right? So the 52%, right, is a figure. It's basically, it's chosen to be consistent with a range of decarbonization paths that, you know, real experts in energy system analysis have produced when they look at economically and technologically feasible ways to get to low carbon, right? And so, that's a lot of words. What we're saying is that these trajectories, like, how do we project the future of what we need? Well, I can tell you as a climate scientist, like, what we need to do in terms of the carbon balance, right? But we need to work as a team of, you know, policymakers, citizens, economists, everyone, to figure out, well, what is the path that gets us there? And so then when you see these paths, when you see like these lines drawn on a graph saying, well, here's where we need to go with our reductions, that's a result of very much a interdisciplinary, but at its foundation, techno-economic analysis. It comes out of these things called integrated assessment models. And what those models basically say is that if we fall too far off the trajectory, it just doesn't appear to be economically feasible to make it to the ultimate goal, right, of carbon neutrality on a time horizon that prevents dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system, right? And so that's why you end up with 52%, because if you run all of these analyses and models and you say, okay, what's a way that's cost feasible to do this with the technologies that we expect to be available over coming decades, 52% kind of falls in the middle of that range. So it's a good choice, and it's an important point. It's an important benchmark. The 2030 target is going to be. It really sits in a part of that ramp towards carbon neutrality. That's going to be a good indicator of how we're doing, I think. So that's where the 52% comes from, right? It's why it's a useful number to look at. Now, when you look at Build Back Better, not all the policies are targeting the 52%. They're all part of the story, but they aren't all just to get to 52%. The ones, you know, and I haven't done this analysis myself, but it makes sense with respect to previous analyses, and what I've read on the Build Back Better is that if you actually break it down, it's some of the clean energy tax incentives and the electric vehicle and heat pump incentives that really get you to that 2030 target. Like, they're really big, right? And I'm sure you have your own analysis, Kai, on that you could share. But then there's a lot of really important stuff in there that might actually be looking past 2030. So you look at some of the investments, certainly in the decarbonization of heavy industry, right? That's going to take a while. That's a hard problem, right? That's not the low-hanging fruit that you capture first. And yet there's investment in that, and that's so important because you can't have a dead end, right? You can't say, we made it to 52% and we made it there in 2030, so we won. It's like, no, that's a midpoint marker. And if you've done that by taking all the low-hanging fruit without thinking about that other 48%, right? Then it's not a good policy path. And so what you're seeing Build Back Better is a balance between those, right? So they're saying, okay, to be responsible, 52% is a responsible number to go for. And then we're going to balance our policies towards that midterm target and the longer term goal of neutrality.
Thank you for that very detailed breakdown. And I appreciated the way you spoke about, what was the term, that integrated?
So integrated assessment models. Yeah. So sorry to throw in jargon, but that I don't run those. I don't run climate models, right? So like physical climate. But those are run by, again, interdisciplinary teams, a lot of economists involved. And those integrated assessment models are that when you, again, anytime you see a path in the future that's talking about emissions reductions, if it's been produced in a scientifically robust way, more than likely it's come from one of these integrated assessment models that's trying to project forward the future of the economy.
Understood. So the one of the things you mentioned, and I want to be careful about how I ask this question, but one of the things you mentioned is the stakes of inaction. I believe you used a word like unmitigated, a phrase like unmitigated anthropogenic climate. The interruption of the cycle. I apologize. I wasn't able to keep up with the jargon, but if you wouldn't mind, I think some people, when they think about the climate crisis, you envision, melting ice caps, polar bears. Maybe you think about extreme weather events. But as we talk about these models and extending years and decades into the future, I think a lot of people just don't know what that looks like. So we talked about what the world would look like if we act. maybe let's talk about the flip side. What do we have to be concerned about if we don't meet these goals?
Yeah. So I think it's important to keep a couple things in focus when we do that. First of all, time scale is important, right? And so whether things are happening in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, 400 years is really relevant to us and our ability to respond to it. Okay. But of course, if you think about unmitigated climate change, you know, it's quite drastic and could be drastic in the relatively short term. And so what are the first ways that you start seeing some of these impacts, I would say, are through water, through the hydrologic cycle, right? And so we're already seeing that with more severe droughts and storms, amped up hurricanes, things like that. So what we're going to see is these kind of shocks, these climate shocks, right? Be it the big forest fires, be it a superstorm, things like this coming more frequently. Okay, so that's the first way you're going to see it, and that I think is really critical because first of all, what that's going to do to agriculture, food systems, infrastructure, etc., right? Natural ecosystems, but also because it's where those lines on a graph that just go smoothly out for the next 100 years are a little misleading, right? So like, when do low-lying cities get abandoned, right? What does that look like? And it's not like you look on the graph, you're like, oh, I'm 2 meters above sea level. So that's when, in 2075, it's 2 meters above sea level. It's like, no, it's gonna happen way before that, right? It's gonna happen when the king tide flooding, when a number of storms that flood your basement or your business just become not worth it anymore, right? And so that's what I'm kind of focused on, is what does, we could answer that question in different time scales, but not necessarily what does the far future look like when the whole map's been rewritten by sea level rise and ecosystems have migrated long distances, but what does it look like over the coming decades, right? And I think what it's going to look like are these episodic extremes, these shocks propagating through our systems that are causing people to revisit their decisions, right? And that's going to cause people to leave where they are, whether it's going to cause the insurance company to force them to leave where they are, right? Whether it's going to cause people to stay in place but change the way they're living in that place, right? That's the question of what it's going to look like. But I will say that it's going to, I think, take the form of repeat punches, right? Not just a slow, steady push is where we're going to see changes soonest.
That's definitely sobering to think about. The image of the shocks, the repeated punches, I think is going to stick with me. And you mentioned an important word there. You mentioned decisions, and I know that it can often feel like these problems are so large, the momentum that's causing them is so immense, and it's been going on for so long that for any one person, it can seem like there's not much to be done, or any action you take would be insignificant in the grand scale. As someone who works on these issues full time, who confronts the sobering realities in a deep and technical level of understanding, what keeps you motivated? What gives you hope? What enables you to keep up the study of this work in this challenging time?
Yeah, and depends on the day you ask that question, right? I mean, for any of us, right? Any of us involved in this work, it's like, is the issue of despair real in our world? It's like, yeah, right. I mean, I'm sure you encounter it. But I'll be honest, not most days for me. It depends on what it depends on so much about your psychology and about what you're specifically working on. But I think that there's a lot of room for hope. Okay, and I think we need to put climate change in context, perhaps with the arc of history, right? So there is a tremendous amount to be excited about, right? Despite all the the negative news, bad headlines we wake up to every day, right? There's a lot to be excited about, and just to keep it at least within the realm of the climate world, right? Like energy systems, energy innovations is like, wow, like the next 50 to 100 years, right? Hard to even envision what's going to be capable. We're on the cusp of so many innovations, right? And that's going to play out in the resilience sector too, right? And the ability of us to work towards towards these kinds of solutions is actually really fascinating. In some ways, we wouldn't wish this upon ourselves, right? But if it is something this difficult to deal with, that is a test of our societies, right? And the way that we respond to those tests, I think, is really motivating to me, because it's not just about the silver bullet technology. It's like, hey, if someone came up with a silver bullet technology, like they figured out free air carbon capture and sequestration in a cost positive way tomorrow, I'd be so happy, right? It's unlikely I'd be happy, but that's actually not. There's actually more to be excited about, perhaps, in the messy solutions to the messy problems, right? Where we take on and say, okay, there isn't a silver bullet, but here are all the things that we can do, such that we can, make exciting advances happen in a way that leads us in a better place than we were when we started. Coming back to that question of resilience, and so that motivates me, because I feel like the way in which we deal with these challenges is really going to be determinative of what a lot of our many dimensions of our society look like in coming decades. And so there's a lot of exciting work to be done there. And I really do. I mean, just last point on this, like, I think climate scientists, like, there's reason for pessimism, but we don't want to act monomaniacally about like this thing. Climate is, I think, the grand challenge of our age. So, like, I don't want to marginalize it compared to other trends, but it is also true that, like, we've gotten a lot better at dealing with disasters, right? Many fewer people die in a disaster now than they did several decades ago, right? Because there's so many things that are going right, and for us, and with economic growth and development and poverty reduction efforts, and so we really need to redouble those efforts.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more, and appreciated your candor, and that there are those difficult days, but I really admired the sources of strength and motivation and the optimism for the future you shared. I have one more question that might take us into a little bit more of that pessimistic space, but hopefully we can steer it back into the optimistic tone before we leave. So I always think about this like the Thanksgiving dinner question. So I know that for people in my line of work, that we can often feel like everyone we talk to is all in for action on climate change. And then there's that uncle or that aunt or that family friend who is still skeptical, or doesn't, quote, believe the science. I'm curious what you would say to those who are skeptical of the severity of the climate crisis, or who would question the work that yourself and others have done to help us understand where we are. And yeah, how would you respond to climate skepticism?
Yeah, no, the Thanksgiving dinner question is a tough one, right? And it depends on your family. It depends on the personalities, right? What's involved. I think one thing that's kind of implicit in all these conversations, right, is that it's important when entering a conversation like that to try to distinguish between true skepticism, right, and politically motivated or ideologically motivated opposition, right? And so if we're talking about the former, so if you have someone that you're talking with, or you can give them the benefit of the doubt, right? They aren't living this all the time, maybe in their community. This is not something that people subscribe to. And as we all know, it's very rational for a person to adopt the beliefs of their surrounding community, right? That's a smart thing to do as a human being. And so that's not, that it can be an honest approach that you come to. And so what I do when given that opportunity, those are the kinds of discussions I kind of enjoy, right? Because you can actually walk through and say, okay, so what element of it, right? Is it that you doubt, right? Is the challenge that you don't think that burning gasoline or fossil fuel emissions are contributing to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, like you don't think there's carbon in the gas, right? Or do you think that yes, there's carbon dioxide and we're increasing it, but it doesn't cause warming, right? Kind of like, that's something else. Or do they think it's a secondary factor? It's like, oh, sure, it's causing warming, but it's not the primary factor, and there's nothing we can do about natural climate variability. Is it that they think, yeah, we're going to warm by what? It's 5 degrees warmer Fahrenheit in 100 years, 50 years. Like, who cares, right? And you go on down that track, right? Because at each of those points, there is either an explanation, right? Sometimes it's quite clear cut, and so you can have that dialogue. And sometimes you get to the point where it's like, oh, I now recognize that we're in the realm of debate, like reasonable debate. Now I can still it's still possible for someone to be wrong in a debate, right? But they can be debating at least with full faculty, right? And saying like, okay, well, you don't think so. Okay, well, let me tell you, like, let me explain a little bit of why we think this matters, right? But I think that very often what ends up happening is that you find out that, in fact, there wasn't that real skepticism there, and that it's that the opposition is, having to do with something like it being too expensive to fix or something else like that. And then that's fine, right? Because then again, you're in this area where it's where, or in your world, Kai, right? It's like, well, how do you explain that, right? And that ends up being a discussion about what policies make sense for us, for our children, for our grandchildren, and that's a discussion that if you can take the blood rushing to the head politics out of it, which is no small feat, right, these days. But if you can do that, it's a fine conversation to have. We should be comfortable having that conversation, right? You don't need to judge somebody because they feel like their view of the future of economic growth is such that they have a high, what we call a high implicit discount rate, that they don't think that we should value things in the future because they'll work themselves out. It's like, okay, well, that's a discussion that needs to be played through and thinking about what is the most responsible and perhaps, risk mitigating approach. But then you're out of the realm of skepticism of the science and you're more into the realm of what's the right thing to do.
Wow, what a thorough and heartfelt answer. I appreciated the way that you acknowledged the importance of, I like this phrase of moving past the blood rushing to the head style political reaction and getting to the ability to debate and to enter questions about policy where we can be right and wrong, but we can make an honest effort to understand one another and move forward. So we're coming up on our time for this interview, and I want to thank you again for taking the time and sharing your insights with us. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. For our last question, I would love to ask you, if someone were to take away just one or two things from our conversation about the state of climate science, about resilience, about the Thanksgiving conversation, and about the Build Back Better Act, what would you want to leave them with? What do you want folks to take away from our conversation?
Yeah, and in some ways that should be the easy question, right? But it's not, right? Because there's so much going on in this issue, and so I think that what I would say is it's important to approach this issue with a full sense of possibility, right? And so, are there some things that we really do need to do? Yes. Are there some scary repercussions of us failing to make certain important policy decisions? Like, we don't want to sugarcoat it, right? Like, yeah, like we really need to get moving on this. But there are many, many degrees of freedom, okay? And so when you're looking at a model, for example, that says we need a 52% reduction by 2030, that's a plausible future. It's a future we should aim for, right? But if we miss it, it's not like game over, right? It's you move, and there are lots of different ways that you can work on policy, lots of different ways you can work on resilience, lots of different ways that you can try to work as an individual, within your family, within your community, within your country, right? To try to strengthen community ties in a way that make you more resilient to climate and everything else. And so climate is a stressor, right? It's a stress test on us. And so again, we wouldn't wish it upon ourselves, but if it's coming, then let's do what we can to pass that stress test. And sometimes that's going to mean a direct lobby for a climate policy, and sometimes it's going to mean something totally different about strengthening your community, about working to end inequality, so there are fewer vulnerable people. I mean, there's all these things we can do to strengthen our society that are climate actions, right? Even if they're not climate action in name, they might be some of the most important things we do. And those are really wonderful things to do that I think a lot of people deeply value in their lives. And so, and not just people who are really on the barricades for climate action, right? And so, so I think that that would be the takeaway, right? That this is a shared challenge, and that's a good thing.
Thank you so much for that answer, and for being with us tonight, Dr. Zaitchik. It's been really thrilling to talk with you and hear your insights. And I hope we can keep the conversation going in the future. Thanks again.
Thanks, Guy.